can AI innovate? It may pull something you hadn't even thought about before. And now, is that innovation yours or is it from the AI, right? It's a little hard to say.
Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of The Product Experience. This week, Randy and I chat to Jody Bailey, the CPTO at Stack Overflow, about how AI is impacting how developers learn and how they've adapted their strategy to embrace it and take care of their dedicated community. Watch or listen on to learn how their engagement metrics have been affected and how they've kept the quality high when using AI.
Jody, thank you so much for joining this week. It's great to have you on the podcast. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Randy. Thanks for having me.
So you are the CPTO at Stack Overflow, and most people probably know who you are and what that means. But do you mind giving us just the 2-minute version? How did you come to be in this role, and what does it mean to be doing that role at Stack Overflow?
Wow, you give me way too much credit, assuming most people know who I am. But thank you. So I became the Chief Product and Technology Officer of Stack Overflow earlier this year in January. Prior to that, I joined Stack Overflow as the CTO. So I was responsible for the technology teams and working with product. I've led product teams in the past, significantly at AWS prior to joining here. But most of my background has been in engineering. And in January, the opportunity came up to lead the product organization. And I was really excited about the opportunity to have a broader impact on the business and in a way become more accountable for what we're doing and delivering. And so that's how I ended up in that role here. In terms of product in general, I think it's one of those areas where, I've had the good fortune of working for some really strong product leaders, seeing the impact that they've had. And throughout my career, I've always kind of taken incremental steps. I wasn't one of those people that had a clear journey or vision of where I wanted to go. It's like, how do I do what I'm doing and do it as well as I can? And then how can I have more positive impact? And I felt like this was a good opportunity to have more positive impact at Stack Overflow. So really excited to be on the role. And I will admit, continuing to learn every day.
Fantastic. So Stack Overflow is at a really interesting point, and it's one of the reasons we really wanted to talk to you, because you've got two main products. You've got your SaaS product, which you deploy within individual companies, and then you've got the public website. And you are known as the authoritative place for people to get answers about how to, tricky coding questions. And now there's AI out there doing this with everyone. And every conversation I have with product leaders, with the engineering managers, and with devs is about how they're using this these days. So how has this affected you? What's going on? Give us the state of play for Stack Overflow at the moment.
Yeah, well, there's a few things at play, right? The obvious thing is, yes, people are getting their answers via LLMs, chatbots, et cetera, more frequently, right? Historically, people have landed on Stack Overflow primarily by going through Google search or other search tools. And I think you're even seeing the search tools being impacted by the chat as well, right? So there's fewer people doing traditional search, or like Google and others, you get the AI integrations right in to the search. So they're getting more summarization and answers there. So that certainly had an impact on the people coming to the site, right? So, if people are able to get the answer just looking for a place to get the answer, they're going to do that. So that's been one thing. The other thing, and you mentioned that we've got two product lines. In fact, we actually have three now, right? And one of them is all of those large language models have to build their large language models on data. And when it comes to expert data on writing code, on answering questions, working through issues, as you mentioned, Stack has that canonical data source. So a lot of the data, that is making those so smart is coming from us. And then that third business line is really licensing access to that content. So in a way, you could look at it as people are getting the answers from Stack. They're just getting it through a third party, which has opened up another product avenue for us in terms of revenue within the company. So, and that's, frankly, as you would expect, is the fastest growing part of our business right now.
So on that part around the LLMs being built on the data and on your data, which is also, I guess, data that kind of comes from the community, one of the sort of big themes around these LLMs in general is that it's taking people's data and knowledge and not necessarily kind of giving people money or compensation in any way for that, and then sort of monetizing it at another level. How are you addressing that within Stack Overflow?
Yeah, that's a great question. And especially where, on Stack Overflow, all the data is contributed by volunteers, by people giving it away, so to speak. And the obligation within our community is that attribution is given back to the people. So people are able to use the content. That's not an issue as long as they provide attribution. So the way that we've been dealing with that is, first trying to prevent, unauthorized use of the content. So we went through a big effort to really lock down the site to prevent scraping, to monitor for bots, all those types of things. Of course, that's a never ongoing battle, right? It's like DDoS or any security things, there's escalations all the time. But then the other aspect is working with these large providers and in our contracts, ensuring that they're to provide attribution. Now, candidly, we haven't seen that everywhere yet, but what I can say is that they're working towards that. And that is part of the agreement that we have, is that happens. So I'll say it's a work in progress, but our intent is to make sure that it's being used appropriately and that the provider or the consumers of it are actually providing that attribution back to the community. Now, there's still some players out there that we're trying to work with to get them to do the right thing, so to speak. But it's a work in progress for sure.
And you mentioned there as well about how search is really being, well, we assume, I haven't actually seen any data on this, but everyone, I think, assumes that search is being impacted by the LLMs as well, and that people are going more directly to the ChatGPTs and Geminis and Claudes. What's your sort of prediction for this in the future? And hello, dog in the background.
That's Ruby. I have no idea what she's barking at.
She has an opinion on this.
She does, for sure. I think that, and I'm speaking, in large part from personal experience, right? Like the way that we use search is changing. And I think search is becoming more of a chat experience. Speaking for myself, I've used Google Chrome. I use it with Gemini. And what I see is that we're not trying to pick out the keywords that will get us the right search. We're just asking the question, right? It's becoming much more natural language. So I think we're going to see more and more of that. I also, I've seen in the industry kind of a shift from, at least it seems, as I work backwards from looking at some of the solutions, I feel like there was a period of time where everybody was trying to use RAG in order to get all the content, summarize it, reformulate it, and provide an answer back. And what I'm seeing more of now, or at least the way it looks to me, is that the LLMs are providing answers, and then we're going back and looking at those answers and trying to find out, doing the search behind the scenes, and then providing the links to the content, which in a way, makes sense, right? If all the content is in the large language model already, then it's probably going to get a pretty good answer, right, within reason. And then you can provide the links to it in order to get the details, right? Which I think that goes in hand with, people don't completely trust AI answers, right? Like, in our dev survey, we see that more people are using it, but fewer, the confidence level has gone down year over year. So I think it's kind of one of those trust but verify. And so what I've seen firsthand is when you just try to summarize on a few articles, you don't get as good of answer as is generated. But with that generated answer, that you've got the content to go check, right? So, I've been in that situation where it's like, okay, that makes sense to me, but let me click on the article and go and see. And then it's like, oh, well, that's what they meant. Maybe the generated answer wasn't exactly right, but at least it gets you close and gets you, in my experience, more often to the right thing. So from a product perspective, I think, we're looking at how can we make that an experience at Stack Overflow so that folks can get answers more quickly. But, when you get to that nuanced part where you just need more meat or more detail, that you can get into the core material to get that information and or interact with the experts, so that we can generate more of that detailed information to continue to improve the models over time.
Jody, this has obviously been something that's, whether you want to call it a disruption or an acceleration of things that were going on, it's obviously had a massive impact on the work you're doing at Stack. And when we scheduled you, we let people in our community know that we'd be talking to you, and there's a huge amount of interest in how you're dealing with things. We recently talked to Paul Adams at Intercom, and he talked about how when ChatGPT first came out, they immediately had a meeting about what are we going to do with our strategy and started revisiting it. And people were really curious. The question came up from a bunch of different people. What kind of conversations were you having at Stack when ChatGPT and LLM started coming? How is this played out based on expectations you had, or were you being proactive? Were you being reactive to these things? What's it been like? Can you give us a peek behind the curtain?
Yeah, it's a tough one. It's like it wasn't that long ago, but it seems so long ago. There's been so many advances, so many things have changed. So, when we first started seeing the declines in traffic or seeing more and more people using large language models and chatbots, we weren't completely surprised. What I'll say is that our parent company had a pretty significant investment in AI research and such. So we were pretty close to what was being provided and what was being generated, and we're able to see some of that. And I feel like at the time we were pretty aggressive in trying to figure out how we could leverage AI in terms of our public platform, in terms of, making a better experience for users, right? And so we invested a fair amount of time with a number of experiments and put them out to see how they would fare. And at that point, I would say that the technology and maybe some of the ways that we had implemented it didn't really meet the bar, so to speak, right? So we ran a number of experiments. We learned a bunch of things. We also learned, how to better leverage it for our SaaS customers, because in that case, it was a better fit in terms of what they were looking for. And so, it's like I'm just thinking about all the decisions we made and the things that have changed, right? Initially, it was so expensive to use large language models. So we're really careful about how much we did or didn't use it, and then now it's so inexpensive, you can be much less conservative in terms of how you do it. But one of the, early on, one of the key decisions that we made from an architectural perspective was we initially focused on our lower tier SaaS solutions in terms of how we could quickly iterate and get feedback, and then recognize that the biggest value was for our larger customers. And then we had to go back and kind of re-engineer things a little bit because they're architecturally so different, right? So that was, I think if I wanted to look at lessons that we learned in hindsight, I think that we probably would have been better off finding a way to iterate with those large customers first, rather than the smaller customers, that allowed us to go fast, because then we still had to, not completely, but we had to really re-architect the solution because the platforms were so different. So, I think it's one of those lessons that shouldn't have to be relearned, but in terms of, focusing our innovation on the largest part of the revenue stream, was probably, something that we learned as we went, as we quickly iterated. So that's one thing that comes to mind. We could probably spend all day talking about lessons learned as we went through that experience.
And I guess one of the things that I find so interesting about your business is, like, obviously you're there to sort of help people find the answer quickly to an engineering problem or a development problem, and to help people learn. But you're such a community organization as well. So just thinking about the solving the problem, like AI and LLMs, is developing into, shall we say, a very elegant solution, quick, it's there, it's on demand. But then you also have this like huge kind of community aspect to your business, which if you kind of don't keep them engaged and on board, and they're the kind of like core of your business, then people may turn away from you as a business in order to get their answers. And so I find that sort of like thing between the conundrum, I guess, of being true to your mission of like helping people learn and find, I actually don't know what your mission statement is, sorry, but then kind of being true to your audience and your customers. That seems like a really difficult space to sit between.
Yeah, no, I think you're hitting on one of the core things that we're really focused on, right? First of all, we talk about what we refer to as the brain drain, right? Like in terms of, if you think about the LLMs, they're only good because of the content. But if everybody just uses the LLMs and doesn't generate new content, then what happens, right? So there's that aspect. We've already talked a little bit about, there are fewer people coming because they're interacting in these other ways. Then there's the aspect, and this is, not unknown to everybody, but it's not always easy to interact on Stack Overflow, right? Our mission, or not the mission, but when it comes to the content that we want to have, it's always been about having canonical information that stands the test of time. Right. And that can make it difficult to ask a good question or even provide a good answer. And so, what we're focused on, and what I hope y'all, if we talk in a year from now, you'll see is that, we're looking for ways to engage the folks that have gone to some of these other interactions. How can we engage them on our site in order to generate that community feeling that you're talking about, to broaden that, re-expand it, but then also in different ways and different types of data that can be valuable, not just, to LLMs, but to each other, right? Because at the end of the day, what we want to do is we really do want to empower technologists, to solve the problems of the world, right? And we believe that human interaction and the way that people intuit and the way they think can raise each other and then raise the broader community to really change things. So, that's what you described is really what we're focused on going forward in terms of how do we continue to grow that sense of community? How do we, make it more appealing to a broader audience of folks?
Jody, I was talking to an engineering manager this week, and he was talking about how when he recruits now for junior devs, it's people who are really great at using prompt engineering as part of their coding development process. And we got into talking about, so the people, that's fantastic. It's an invaluable skill and tool. We know that. But at the same time, how do you develop the skills that you need when there's a production incident? How do you develop the skills to know that the code that's coming out of the AI development process is good in quality? Things like that. And community seems like a huge part of this, but I'm also worried that I'm the old guy insisting that everyone use an abacus or a slide rule when there's a calculator. So how do you approach this both in, with your dev teams and with the community of devs that you're working with?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? And I feel you. I remember in college and, the advanced math and everything, you always started off with the hard way of doing something. And then somebody tells you, well, but nobody does it that way, right? And it's a little bit of that, I feel. And, it's, I heard, I think it was one of the founders from Windsurf talking about, like, if you need senior engineers to diagnose the issue, but everybody's writing prompts, and there's no real entry level, how do you get those senior engineers to do it? And the thing that I, want to believe is that one, just like developers want to contribute to public communities to help each other. Just like, developers love developing when they're not working. My belief is that people are going to want to understand what's going on behind the scenes, and they're going to, the ones that are going to be really true engineers building scalable solutions that they can debug are the ones that are going to be curious and that are going to look at what is actually being generated and try to understand it. And in order to do that, they're going to have a community of peers to talk about and exchange ideas and say, hey, I did this and it's doing this weird thing. What does that do? How do I make sense of that? And what I'd like to think is that there will be places like Stack Overflow or Stack Overflow for Teams where they can have those conversations, where they can ask the question about something that was generated, or even ask, where should I look at the generated thing, right? If you've played around with any of these tools, you just watch it writing all this code, writing all these files, and if it's somebody that's inexperienced, they may not even know where to look. So, I do think that there's still value in the fundamental computer science that folks learn. But for a long time, people don't just come out of school and just write code, right? I mean, they can write code, but they don't really understand. So I think that there's going to have to be some intentionality around it. And if you fast forward, who knows how long, right? I can imagine a world where we eventually get to a point where you're able to use prompts to debug and fix, right? I don't think we're there, but I think that it's going to require, one, people having curiosity, investing their own time, and then working with their peers.
I'm not sure I'm looking forward to a world where there's, products and apps and sites that have a label on them of 100% artisanal code.
It's funny. I was reading, and there was an old blog post from Jeff Atwood, one of our founders, and he was talking about a game where people wrote code in assembly language, right? It's going to become, a game to be able to write code by hand, right? So new puzzles.
Do you think there's going to be different types of engineering, like different engineering roles in the future with the age of AI coming on board? You have your kind of full stack, front end, back end, Are you going to have like an AI specialist, or are you going to have maybe even, as you said, like everyone will kind of be using AI, but you'll have your non-AI like architect who can do everything or something like that? How do you see sort of engineering teams and roles evolving in the future?
It's an interesting question. And, I have a pat answer, but as you were asking, I started thinking about it more deeply. It's like, oh, it's interesting. The pat answer I have is like, I think everybody's going to become an engineer, right? To some degree, or at least more and more people. I think that as a good product manager with good understanding, it's getting to the point where you can write some pretty interesting solutions, right? That said, I think that there is still, and probably for the foreseeable future, the necessity of being able to figure out how to scale, how to secure all those types of things. And so we'll still have some of those roles, but it is interesting. People have been talking about it for a long time, but you have prompt engineers, right? And what does that mean, right? So, kind of a long-winded way of saying, I don't know exactly, right? Like, in terms of thinking about it, I think that you still kind of have that general hierarchy where you have people that are more expert in certain areas than others. You have people that are generalists, so I think that you'll still have some of that, like even thinking from a design perspective, right? There are people that just intrinsically have a better sense, right? They are better able to create a design, and the AI can help you get there, right? And if I think about, AI writing code and think about the way maybe you might use it in writing a document, right? You may use it to help, formulate your ideas into a structure, but then you've got to come back and you still have to rework it and make it, the way you want it. And design is the same way, I think, right? If you design something, you get it, it gets close, right? But at some point, I think it requires that really nuanced approach and look. And that's where I think you'll see those experts and specialists. So, it may be, just like in photography, you have people that are really good at editing images, right? And using different tools. So you see the same type of thing with code in the future.
Jody, there's always been the question of, should product managers, do they need to know how to code, or do they need to know how to design? And it sounds like from that answer that you're going in the direction everyone needs to learn how to prompt properly. But I'm guessing there's a difference between having those basic skills and being able to shape and perfect. And is that where development is going? It's taking the basics and optimizing and turning it to really production ready?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, right now, when we want to iterate quickly and get feedback on an idea, to me, that seems like a perfect place for generating code and, working with product managers and designers and even engineers. We want them in that process to quickly iterate, but those aren't the things that we're likely to take production to production, at scale. So I think that, yes, there'll be a way of taking that and eventually enhancing it, evolving it. Right now, I think we're still kind of in the phase of, well, it's a good way to validate ideas and get feedback. And then, how do we take that to the next step? Just like tools, a much better version of the, initial tools we use for prototyping and such.
And I'm curious to talk a little bit more about your team structure, because you are CPTO, but so you have got product, you've got development, and you've got design under you. But when we talked earlier, you told me about there's a fourth pillar of the team that reports up to you.
So there's a fourth pillar that doesn't report to me that I'm peers with. So we refer to it, product design, engineering, and community. So the community organization is led by a peer of mine, and we both report into the CEO. So there was a point in time when I first joined that prior to me joining, all product development engineer or design engineering and community reported into the former CPTO. And then when I joined, I took over the technology and community stayed there. So at this point in time, evolution, now product and engineering and design all report to me, and community reports to the CEO, which candidly, I think, is a good thing. There's a good, healthy tension there, as we try to evolve and move forward to make sure that we're representing the existing community, the folks that, are tried and true and committed. And then as we try to expand and evolve into new spaces.
One of the other questions that came from the community was around innovation and whether you think innovation will continue to come from come from humans, or whether it could come from AI in the future as well.
Mm-hmm. It's an interesting question. I mean, so I don't know. I feel like we could get philosophical here, right? In terms of what is innovation? Does anybody really innovate, or are we just borrowing ideas and putting them together in different ways, right? So, as I think about, can AI innovate with the right prompting, maybe, right? I mean, at the end of the day, it's telling you something, and that's already been said. But if I think about myself, I won't project. Most of my ideas are just an amalgamation of all the experiences I've had, and then putting them together in maybe a different way. So, you can imagine that if you were leveraging an LLM and asking it questions or prompting it to do this or that, and it may pull something you hadn't even thought about before, and now, is that innovation yours, or is it from the AI, right? It's a little hard to say. I'm not as rigorous as some people that say, well, if AI can't innovate. Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm just repackaging all the things I've learned. Why can't you do that with AI?
Jody, I'm curious, and as we talked about earlier, as you said earlier, Stack's one of the USPs for the public site is that you have the canonical answers, and that's something that's attracted people for a long time. It's also the reason that you are feeding all the a bunch of LLMs. So you've got a very high level of trust in the information on Stack. People are using LLMs and tools like that because it's about speed and convenience. And you said, on Stack, it's not always the quickest or the easiest thing, but it's definitive. How do you continue to grow in this case? How do you continue to, what is the trade-off between trust, speed, and convenience in the future? How does Stack look at that?
The growth is really dependent on the fact that there's new emerging technology and that people need to be able to interact with folks and get questions answered, and that there are people willing to support that. I think to assume that Stack won't grow is to assume that there won't be new technologies, right? And I don't believe that to be true. So I think, the way that, we move forward is obviously we continue to support the canonical answers, and we work with, broadening the scope and being appealing to the younger developers, to newer people in their career, and addressing the concerns that they have. I think that we also need to look at, how do we kind of create a pathway to those canonical answers, right? How do we make it, so that you can go from, 0 to 100 as opposed to just having to start at 100. If you think about, one way of thinking about Stack Overflow is, okay, well, this is where, the PhDs all, talk and put their information, but, what's the undergrad program? How do you get to that point? How do you ask questions that maybe aren't canonical, but are really important, or maybe they're just a derivative of something that's already there? Right now, we don't allow, kind of the nuanced version of something because we want to have the canonical answer. But how do we maybe allow that to happen? How do we allow people to get questions for their homework done? So I think it's one is, focusing on expanding the breadth of technology that we solve for. I think it's also expanding the personas and the people that want to participate in this, making it easier and appealing to that. And the combination of those things will allow us to develop. And I think we also need to be open to the fact that we may have some data that's non-canonical, right? And that's okay. As long as there's that pathway from entry level to advanced, I think is really what we want to support.
And Jody, with your new remits across product as well as engineering at Stack Overflow, I'd love to know with the world kind of changing and evolving so quickly around all of us, what are you sort of most looking forward to?
Oh, boy. What am I most looking forward to? Honestly, what I'm most looking forward to, and this is probably maybe a little narrow, but what I'm most looking forward to is, people talking about Stack Overflow as the place that they go to hang out, to get any sort of technology answer or anything related to technology. I know that's fairly self-centered and narrow, maybe not what you were asking, but I'm really looking forward to the evolution of Stack Overflow. I've been a Stack Overflow, fan or user for a very long time. And so many people, hold it near and dear. And I'd like to be able to be in a place where, there's a whole new generation of people that hold Stack Overflow near and dear. And maybe it's not at all what I grew up with.
Jody, thank you so much. This has been fantastic. I love hearing about the way you're looking at the future. There are way too many people who think that they are owed their business model and it's kind of, they need to hold on to it regardless. The fact that you guys are looking at this and the evolution in the future and taking such a considered view of it is really reassuring. And we're really looking forward to seeing where you all go.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. It's been a pleasure being here. Enjoyed talking with both of you.
The Product Experience hosts are me, Lily Smith, host by night and Chief Product Officer by day.
And me, Randy Silver, also host by night. And I spend my days working with product and leadership teams, helping their teams to do amazing work.
Luran Pratt is our producer, and Luke Smith is our editor.
And our theme music is from product community legend Arnie Kittler's band, POW. Thanks to them for letting us use their track.